Hi, everyone. I'm Simone Boyce in for Allison Morris. You're watching NBC News Now. Here's what's happening.
You know, losing a son, a daughter, a husband, a wife is like being sucked into a big black hole in the middle of your chest, and you don't think there's any way out. You wonder what's happening. So my heart goes out, our hearts go out to all those who we've lost.
13 U.S. service members killed, more than 100 civilians dead. President Biden vowing to retaliate against the people behind the terror attack in Kabul as evacuations resume. What he's saying about the mission to get Americans and our allies out.
I've had no clue a hurricane was even coming. So I guess got to prepare a little bit, but it's nothing that we haven't, gone through before.
A significant threat heading towards Louisiana. Hurricane Ida expected to slam into the Gulf Coast on the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. We're tracking the storm's path. And public health experts sounding the alarm. Vital COVID data disappearing in several states, even as the Delta variant surges. Where it's happening. We start today with the latest on the Kabul airport attack. President Biden praising the 13 U.S. service members who lost their lives in yesterday's attacks and vowing to retaliate against ISIS-K. NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli joins me now. Mike, earlier the president was in the Situation Room meeting with his national security team, commanders, as well as diplomats in the field. What is the White House saying about efforts to mitigate the active threat from ISIS that remains in these crucial final days?
Well, Simone, the White House has been warning really throughout this entire crisis with the fall of Kabul about the possibility of an ISIS attack. Sadly, we saw yesterday that realized with the loss of 13 American members of the armed services and dozens of others, civilians as well. But today, those warnings got even more specific. It wasn't just that there's the possibility of an ISIS attack. Officials were saying that they expected one. Now, thankfully, it is after midnight in Kabul, and the day went by without such an attack. But this is obviously something that officials are very closely monitoring as we're in these final hours, really, of evacuation efforts at the Kabul airport. What officials were also specifying today, as you can hear another summer rainstorm descending upon us here at the White House, that the information flow, which has been pretty steady from the White House, from the Pentagon, is going to get a little bit tighter now. As we get into these final hours, it becomes a much more sensitive operation. They know, as we've seen tragically, what a target the airport is. And so the Pentagon press secretary today warning about those threats, leading to them being less forthcoming with information. Now, the president talked about what was proceeding here for the next few days earlier this morning at the White House. Let's take a listen to his latest comments on this.
The mission there being performed is dangerous, and is now it's come with a significant loss of American personnel. And but it's a worthy mission because they continue to evacuate folks out of that region, out of the airport. Evacuated more than 12,000 additional people out of the airport in the last 24 hours.
Now, Simone, the White House says that we expect the president to remain at the White House all weekend. Typically, the president has been leaving town, going back home to Delaware or to Camp David, but he will remain here in Washington, not just monitoring the continued efforts to evacuate Americans and others in Afghanistan, but, of course, that hurricane that's bearing down on the Louisiana coast, potentially making landfall on Sunday, Simone.
Yeah, hard to imagine leaving Washington with everything that's on his plate right now. Mike, I want to pivot to the latest on evacuations. How does yesterday's attack change the pace at which this administration will move to evacuate Americans and Afghan allies by this deadline that's approaching on Tuesday?
It really is remarkable, Simone, that we have continued to see flights taking off from the airport there. Some more than 12,000 individuals were evacuated again, just in the most recent period that the White House provided information for. And significantly this afternoon, from both the White House and from the State Department, information about specifically the number of Americans that have been evacuated. Some 5,100 now have made their way from Kabul. An additional 300, they say, have been in touch and potentially are on their way out as we speak. Now, that is out of a total of 6,000 that Secretary of State Tony Blinken said was their best analysis of how many Americans were on the ground trying to get out. So when you add that to another significant number we got from the Pentagon just in the last hour or so, 6,578 of those SIV, special immigrant visa applicants, have now been processed at these third-party sites once they've left Kabul. That is obviously the priority population, Americans and these SIV applicants. When you consider that since August 14th, we've evacuated some more than 100,000 individuals from Kabul. Obviously, it's a significant and despite the tragic loss of life, the State Department spokesperson Ned Price calling it largely successful operation, but still some work to be done in these final days.
Mike, the soundbite of the day today from White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, who said the president doesn't want the ISIS-K terrorists who killed our service members to, quote, live on the earth anymore. It doesn't get any more clear about that. But can you tell us any more about how that retaliation would be carried out, especially in light of the fact that Biden's mission at this point is to eliminate our military presence there?
Well, the president himself said yesterday he'd asked his commanders to provide him with some possible plans here. But you can't separate the likelihood at this stage of a retaliation against ISIS-K from these ongoing evacuation efforts. I think the president is going to be very careful moving forward with engaging in any operation that could further compromise the efforts that are underway at the Kabul airport. At the same time, you also want to make sure that you're putting pressure on ISIS to potentially deter and mitigate any threat that remains in Kabul. So this is a very, yet another incredibly difficult decision ahead of the president to launch an operation. And I've been reminded, as I think back of what Vice President Biden was doing in the Situation Room when President Obama was faced with a decision with regard to Osama bin Laden. These are high risk, but also high reward operations. And you can be sure that President Biden is going to be wanting to triple, quadruple, quintuple check any potential plan or operation that's presented to him about a strike on ISIS in Afghanistan and what the consequences could potentially be.
Mike, on top of everything that's unfolding in Afghanistan, President Biden also meeting with Israel's prime minister. It was supposed to happen Thursday, but their bilateral meeting was postponed, of course, due to the Kabul attack. What was the goal of today's talks?
Well, it's so interesting. In advance, prior to yesterday's tragic loss of life, the White House had been saying that this meeting was sort of an example of why the U.S. needed to be withdrawing from Afghanistan. It was so that the U.S. could redouble its efforts to focus on the threat of terrorism more generally, but also to do everything it can, as it often does, for our strongest ally in the Middle East, which is Israel. Now, another fascinating dynamic, really, to this meeting today is in President Biden and in Prime Minister Bennett, you couldn't have more different views in terms of the approach to Iran's nuclear threat. Obviously, President Biden, part of the Obama administration, which pursued that nuclear deal, and Prime Minister Bennett, who has been also the defense minister in Israel, has been really a staunch critic of that. That is obviously one of the biggest differences here. But what these two men have in common, they don't want to see Bibi Netanyahu become prime minister again. We talk often about the very narrow numbers that Biden has in Democrats in the Congress. Well, Bennett's coalition government is as careful and fragile as any, and so they are working to project unanimity here and a strong alliance for their own domestic political reasons as well.
Mike Memoli from a stormy Washington, D.C. Thanks so much, Mike.
Thanks, Simone.
ISIS-K is claiming responsibility for the Kabul airport attack. The Pentagon says the group is a serious terror threat. So who are they? And how do they fit into the larger landscape of resistance groups scattered throughout Afghanistan? NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrew Mitchell gives us a closer look.
With just 4 days until President Biden's deadline for withdrawing from Afghanistan, a growing threat to the evacuation of the remaining Americans and Afghan allies, the terror group known as ISIS-K.
I've repeatedly said this mission was extraordinarily dangerous, and on why I've been so determined to limit the duration of this mission.
The group, formed 6 years ago in Pakistan, has now taken root in Afghanistan, gaining even more force when the Taliban, during their march toward Kabul, released thousands of terrorists from the country's prisons, including ISIS-K fighters. Now the group is challenging the Taliban for control.
ISIS-K is clearly the group which has the greatest straight antipathy for the West and the United States. But the only good side of that is they also have antipathy for the Taliban. And the Taliban have no love for them either.
The CENTCOM commander warns ISIS-K could launch more attacks at any moment.
They aim to get a vehicle-borne suicide attack in if they can, from a small vehicle to a large vehicle. They're working all those options. And then we've just seen their ability to deliver a walk-in, a vest-wearing suicide attacker.
The ISIS-K is not the only threat to the U.S. evacuation mission in these final days. The Taliban have put the leader of the Haqqani network, Khalil Haqqani, who has ties to al-Qaeda, in charge of security in Kabul. Haqqani has a $5 million U.S. bounty on his head and brazenly showed up a week ago at Friday prayers in Kabul.
The Haqqanis are expert at two things: taking people hostage and committing mass murder attacks of this scale.
For more on the situation in Afghanistan, let's bring in NBC News Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kuby. Courtney, today the Pentagon saying there was only one attack, not two as initially reported yesterday. So we're learning a lot more about what happened. Let's listen.
I can confirm for you that we do not believe that there was a second explosion at or near the Barron Hotel, that it was one suicide bomber.
So obviously some of those initial reports can be a bit confusing, but what is the latest from the Pentagon on the active threats that remain in Kabul?
And you had the perfect word there, and that is active threats, because they are continuing. They are specific to the airport there in Kabul, and there is a lot of concern and preparation for the very real reality that another attack may be in the planning and maybe even potentially underway. So what we know is, we heard a little bit there from General Taylor, and in Andrea's story, or Andrea's spot, we heard from General McKenzie. He's the head of Central Command. During his briefing yesterday, he said that they are expecting another attack, and he laid out some of the ways. One was a potential suicide attack, like we saw the horrible attack at Abbey Gate yesterday. The other possibility, the vehicle-borne explosive that he also mentioned there, and that is a concern that ISIS militants could pack a vehicle with explosives and then drive it onto the airport and detonate. A third one is an attack from a rocket. One real concern that the military has here is not just them lobbing potential rockets onto the airfield and maybe pocking up the runway, causing a disruption in the evacuation effort, but a real concern is actually them trying to take out an aircraft. You have these large cargo planes with hundreds of evacuees on them. If they were to take out one of those, it would be a devastating and catastrophic attack, Simone.
Courtney, we've still got to make it to Tuesday. We've still got thousands of people that are trying to get out of there. So what is changing now in terms of our cooperation with the Taliban, the way that we rely on them for security as the Pentagon anticipates the potential of more attacks like you just laid out?
So right now, the U.S. military is still cooperating with the Taliban on the ground there. It's something I think our viewers would be really surprised to hear about, and that the U.S. military there is communicating and coordinating actions with their Taliban counterparts there in Kabul, something that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks ago. The Taliban actually have been cooperating there. They are at times helping with safe passage for Americans to get to the airport. But I think when you talk about the overall security structure that the U.S. is really relying on the Taliban for, it's really how they have provided or created this perimeter around the airport. Literally, the airport is completely surrounded by Taliban fighters, and most of these are their most capable fighters. So think of them as sort of the special operations forces of the Taliban. They, in this perimeter, they have set up checkpoints, and they are literally screening people to get towards the airport area. Now, we've heard a lot about how they're not allowing people through. There's reports of them beating individuals, especially Afghans who are trying to get through. So I'm not in any way trying to paint this as some sort of a perfect process here, but when it comes down to it, the reality is the U.S. there at the airport, the first layer of security that's provided before people get to that airport area is by the Taliban, Simone.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because the attack took place where crowds are gathering, where they're trying to get into the airport, where Marines are reviewing documents and visa applications. So how does this ongoing security threat disrupt this crucial screening process for the Afghans who are trying to get out, and any remaining Americans as well?
So while there's no question that it's going to bring an already extremely tense situation and security concern to a new level, the reality is the U.S. military is continuing to screen people. Even today, they continued screening people yesterday after this attack. So it has slowed and added just another layer of difficulty to an already extremely difficult situation. But the evacuation mission has continued, and the U.S. Marines, who were already in a very dangerous, perilous situation. They've screened over 100,000 people in the way that that this happened yesterday. This attacker came in. They're getting right up close to these people, at times patting them down, checking them for weapons and explosives. And that is continuing even today, and we should expect it to continue until the very last hours of this evacuation mission on August 31st.
You can just sense the desperation for the people who are trying to get out. Just a devastating, maddening situation all around. Courtney, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, joining me now is Sean Washington. He's a former Navy hospital corpsman who served in Iraq and Pakistan, and now a program manager at Shift, a company that helps veterans discover new careers. Sean, I came across your tweet as I was scrolling last night, and I was hoping that you'd be available to talk to us today, because you offer such a crucial and an important perspective as a veteran. You tweeted this from your account at Gay Black Vet yesterday afternoon. You said, military is one of the few jobs out there where no matter how far removed you are from service, there's always a hint of survivor's guilt when you learn of others being killed in action. Sean, the Navy confirming today that a sailor was killed in the Kabul attack. What does survivor's guilt feel like?
Thanks for having me on, Simone. Yeah, I would say for me personally, survivor's guilt feels like, regardless of how outrageous the circumstances or situation may be, and regardless of where you currently are, you always feel like there's more that you could have done. I think that for the most part, any service member who's ever been deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan or any sort of combat theater always looks back at their service and their time in theater, wondering, is there anything that they could have done better, or is there anything they could have done differently that would have changed the outcome of certain situations that may have cost the lives of fellow shipmates or fellow service members. So it's carrying around this sort of immense responsibility, always wondering what if, and that just stays in the back of your mind. And hearing about the attack yesterday, and especially hearing how a corpsman was one of the casualties, I myself being a corpsman and knowing less than 15 corpsmen have been killed in Afghanistan over the last 20 years of war, that really weighed heavily on me.
And I would imagine in times like these, this is when the veteran community really comes through, because you want to talk to people who have walked in your shoes, who know what you're feeling. What have your conversations been like over the last 24 hours with other veterans?
Oh, God, the conversations over the last 24 hours have been just people questioning their entire service, wondering if it was all for nothing, wondering if there was anything that they could have done differently. Like, I got out in 2011. Right when I transferred over to another duty station, as an example, during my final 2 years in the military, I left 2nd Lab Battalion, who I deployed with two times to Iraq, and went to what they call a shore duty station called Wounded Warrior Regiment. Later on, my former command deployed to Afghanistan. It was an extremely brutal deployment for them. And in the back of my mind, I was just like, man, I just should have stayed at that duty station. I should have been on the ground with them. Maybe things I could have done could have changed the trajectory of how that deployment went. And for the most part, these are the exact same conversations I'm hearing from other veterans and other service members who have been in the military and been in theaters of war and have served alongside people who aren't here today and continue to see people serving in harm's way today. I think that there's this feeling when you're in the military, this is another topic that's come up quite consistently. When you're in the military, you live and breathe Afghanistan, Iraq, the global war on terror. This is something that's been going on for 20 years. But once you leave the military, you kind of realize that while it seems like you were standing still, the rest of the world has essentially moved on, and these forces have sort of slipped out of the collective consciousness of the country. So in the back of your mind, you almost feel like you have nobody else but the rest of your brothers and sisters that you've served with, even people that you weren't necessarily stationed with. These are people that you care about immensely, even though you've never even met them, because it oftentimes feels like we're the only ones who actually understand what's going on.
But you actually work for an organization that is trying to be part of that solution. Shift helps veterans pivot into other careers. So what can we do as Americans to support our veterans during times like this? I mean, do you welcome your friends and family checking in on you?
Yeah, absolutely. I welcome friends and family. I think the best thing that you can do is just be an ear. A lot of veterans, especially with what's been going on with Afghanistan, is slow deterioration of the country and the government being dissolved. A lot of folks are wrangling with a lot of emotions that, again, a huge segment of the population don't quite understand. So these folks have been carrying this stress with them into work daily. There are people I know, veterans I know, who've been trying to get their interpreters out of country, trying to get families of people that were allies out of country, and have been having a couple of restless nights and restless weeks since this whole withdrawal has begun. So I think that being an ear, being empathetic, trying to understand that these decisions that we make in uniform are things that we carry with us for the rest of our lives. I am not remotely envious of the Marines on the ground right now, who quite frankly are in a position of deciding who gets on a plane, who doesn't, who lives or who dies. And these are things that are going to shape their entire lives for the remainder of, their service and even afterwards. So just being an ear is, I would say, the best thing that you can do.
And while those service members are on the ground in Afghanistan making these life-changing decisions, meanwhile, back here in Washington, there's all this blame going around and people pointing fingers and trying to establish accountability for what happened. But this goes beyond politics, which can turn toxic so quickly. So if viewers take away one thing from the situation in Afghanistan, what do you hope that is?
I hope the one thing folks take away is that ultimately war is awful. If anything, the last 20 years have taught us is that war is a no-win situation. But even more importantly, just knowing that there are people who are served in the military, as politicians slowly begin to frame recent events and shape their own narratives, one thing that I wish everybody knew is that when you're on the ground, you don't care about anything other than completing the mission, making sure your friend goes home, even if that's at the expense of your own life. The Republicans are the ones who cause all this. There's no Biden is the one who screwed everything up. All we care about is the mission and getting each other home. And we don't even have politics on our radar at all.
Sean, thank you so much for being here and sharing your perspective.
Thank you very much for having me.
To any veterans watching, we see you. If you're a veteran who needs help or know one who does, you can contact the Veterans Crisis Line. The number is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text 838-255 or visit www.veteranscrisisline.net. All right, senators getting an unclassified briefing on Afghanistan today after the deadly Kabul attack. NBC News national political reporter Sahil Kapoor has the growing political fallout on Capitol Hill.
Simone, the situation in Afghanistan and that terrorist attack yesterday in Kabul has led to a growing number of Republicans calling for President Biden's resignation or his impeachment. Now, this is not going to happen. There's no indication that the president is going to step down, but it does suggest that Republicans see this as a short-term political gain for them. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy was asked questions about whether he supports the calls for resignation or impeachment earlier. Let's play some of what he had to say and talk about it on the other side.
I'm extremely frustrated with this president. As I said, if you want to be president of the free world, you have to have the faith, the trust, and the confidence of the American public. President Biden lost that yesterday. There will be a day of reckoning, and we have a constitutional rights Right now, in the next 5 days, everyone's responsibility should only be focused on getting the Americans out.
Now, that was not a yes, as you heard, but that was not a no. He's keeping his options open, and that is a short-term political front. The bigger, tougher question for McCarthy is what he would have done differently than President Biden and where he believes the president went wrong. And this is where McCarthy is getting tripped up, because on one hand, he is not saying whether there should be a longer or permanent U.S. troop presence on the ground. A majority of Americans want to see troops withdrawn, so he's in a tough spot there. The other question is negotiating with the Taliban. He faults President Biden for doing that, but Donald Trump did the same thing when he was president, and McCarthy didn't seem to have much of a problem with that. He was asked what the difference was. He said, well, Trump has conditions. Of course, Biden has his conditions too. It all speaks to this enormous challenge of how do you bring an orderly end to a 20-year civil war that has led to an entire state and its armed forces collapsing like the house of cards in a matter of days. The big question for members of Congress, once this evacuation mission is complete, is going to be what to do with a lot of these refugees, and we're already seeing some divides there. A group of nearly 70 House Democrats is calling on President Biden to massively expand his refugee admissions to a minimum of 200,000. There are already some calls on the right wing of the Republican Party saying absolutely not, no more refugees should come here. That is an issue I suspect we'll be hearing a lot more about in the coming weeks and months.
Welcome back, everyone. Time now to check in with NBC News Digital reporter Maya Eaglin. She's following the latest headlines from NBCnews.com. Maya, take it away.
Hey, Simone, thanks. We start with Peloton under fire again. The Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security have subpoenaed the company for documents and information about reported injuries by customers. The fitness equipment maker is also being investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission for its public disclosures of those reports. Earlier this year, the company issued a widespread recall for both of its treadmills after at least one child was killed and dozens of other users reported injuries. A troubled federal jail in New York City is closing. The Metropolitan Correctional Center is being temporarily shut down due to several issues, including lax security and crumbling infrastructure. The jail gaining national attention 2 years ago after disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide there while he was awaiting trial. The decision to close the facility coming after the U.S. Deputy Attorney General toured the facility and saw the conditions firsthand. Time's Up CEO Tina Chen is resigning. The advocacy group facing mounting backlash for aiding former NY Governor Andrew Cuomo during his sexual misconduct scandal. Chen tweeting today she is, quote, aware that my position at the helm of Time's Up has become a painful and divisive focal point. Her resignation comes just weeks after former Time's Up chairwoman Roberta Kaplan stepped down. A major act of kindness following tragedy in Tennessee. An anonymous donor will cover the funeral costs for 20 victims of the devastating flood in Waverly last weekend. The area hit with record rainfall, leaving many without homes. The donor, who wished to remain unnamed, personally stopped in at different funerals in the community to cover the expenses. And a first-time Paralympian breaks her own world record. 17-year-old swimmer Anastasia Pagonis took home the first gold medal for the U.S. in the Tokyo Paralympics. She shaved almost 2 seconds off her 400-meter freestyle time, a record she'd previously set during this year's USA Paralympic trials. Fellow Team USA swimmer Gia Pergoloni also setting a world record in the 100-meter backstroke. You can stream all the Paralympics on all NBC platforms. Simone, it's so great to see Gia and Anastasia doing so well.
Maya, that is exactly the kind of news that we need after the week we've had. Thank you so much. Well, Ida strengthening to hurricane status. It's expected to gain even more power throughout the weekend and make landfall in Louisiana on Sunday on, get this, the 16th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. NBC News meteorologist Michelle Grossman joins me now. Michelle, the New Orleans mayor is already calling for some evacuations. I mean, how bad is this storm looking?
Hi there, Simone. So good to see you. Well, it's looking bad. We're looking at a significant storm by late Sunday into early Monday morning. Right now, looks to be a Category 3 storm at landfall, but some models that we trust and are reliable are pointing at a Category 4 storm. So let's give you the latest and then what we think is going to happen over the next 48 hours. So the latest, it made a landfall a few hours ago over the center of the Isle of Youth, and that's in Cuba. So 75-mile-per-hour winds is a Category 1 storm. And then it's going to emerge into the Gulf of Mexico. So the Caribbean is so warm. It feeds into the Gulf of Mexico, some of the warmest waters right now on the planet. And hurricanes are like engines. So it's going to give it that gasoline it needs to blossom into a Category 2 storm by Saturday at 7 o'clock, 105-mile-per-hour winds. But then look what happens. It's going to intensify even more as it approaches the coast of Louisiana. So Sunday by 7 o'clock, 120-mile-per-hour winds. We expect that landfall anywhere between Sunday evening and very early Monday morning, excuse me. And when you have landfalling hurricanes, you could see some tornadoes, and that would happen overnight. So that adds to the danger. What we're concerned about are very strong winds. Of course, these winds are going to stretch out 250 miles. We're concerned about life-threatening flooding, life-threatening storm surge. So I'll go through that with you. And then as it emerges inland, we're still going to be a significant rain event. We're going to see rains up to 20 inches in some spots, and it's going to move very slowly once it gets inland. Now, all these lines are computer models, and this is what we look at. That black line, that's the National Hurricane Center, and that's where, we look at the most. But then we also take into account all these other models, and it looks like we're all in agreement for where we're going to see this landfall, somewhere in south-central Louisiana into southeastern Louisiana. And Simone, as we go throughout time, again, I mentioned those tropical alerts, a hurricane watch. This is the time now to prepare. Tomorrow you need to prepare. You need to evacuate. A lot of people along this coast, they know where to go. So you need to follow your evacuation plan. And then we're just going to track it all weekend for you. It looks like that landfall, Simone, will be on Sunday evening into Monday morning.
All of this so fresh for residents there. Michelle, thank you so much.
Sure.
When it comes to your mask mandates, I'm here to tell you, and I speak with a lot of these folks out here, we will not comply with your crap.
Oof. Heated debate brewing in one Tennessee school district where COVID cases have increased 40% in just 4 days. Last night, the Williamson County School Board voted to extend requiring masks in schools beyond just elementary students, and many parents aren't happy about the decision, and they have been fighting back. NBC News Now correspondent Dasha Burns was at that meeting, and she's going to debrief us now on what exactly happened there. So, Dasha, the school behind you shut down earlier this month because so many students and staff called out sick due to COVID. Yet last night, we heard many people there spoke up against a mask mandate, and it looks like it got intense. So what exactly went down?
Yeah, and you may actually remember this school district, which went viral earlier this month for some videos from their previous school board meeting, which got extremely contentious. Some anti-mask protesters chasing doctors out to their cars. This time, security was out in full force. I'll tell you, I think we saw 30-plus officers on site. And remember, this is at a school board meeting. They were able to keep things under control, but the tensions were high. And Simone, I want to play you a moment that encapsulates and really is emblematic of how school board meetings have become the new frontier for culture wars and political divisions. We were talking to folks outside of the building before the meeting. We interviewed one of the doctors there who was one of the few people there in favor of mask mandates. Watch what happened.
I'm going to beg for the help of our community to prevent. I'm a physician, and I'm trying to help our community here. Our hospitals are full, and we're asking for help.
You're talking to the fake news. They will twist whatever you're saying. I wasn't having a conversation with you.
This is amazing. I'm here to talk to you as your community member.
Because we lost 12 servicemen in Afghanistan. That is a lot more important than this, and you know it.
Okay.
Ma'am, why are you here today? Why are you here today?
Because I have children and grandchildren that I want to live free. Breathing in poison. And this is all smoke and mirrors. This is tyranny.
What do you mean by medical tyranny?
Excuse me, I gotta go. We don't have rights anymore. That's what it means.
We literally have come up with an incredibly safe and efficacious vaccine, and people don't want to accept it. There's little to no side effects. It's very effective, and people are behind me screaming about how it's tyranny and it's communism and it's silly is what it is. I mean, literally, they've got a doctor here telling them how safe it is.
Simone, Dr. Meredith Duke says she has 2 children of her own who have been exposed to COVID-19. She says that her hospital is overwhelmed. And I'll tell you, we talked to some of the folks that were at this meeting who say that they weren't actually parents of kids in the school district. They simply showed up to make their voices heard. Simone.
Dasha, I cannot believe that you caught that exchange on camera. I mean, that says it all right there. I'm speechless after seeing that. And we heard that doctor begging for community support, begging for parent support, but clearly they don't have that. So how are administrators at Fairview Middle planning to enforce mask wearing and protect students?
Yeah, it's a great question and a tough one, because right now, because of the state policy, the schools actually do need to provide an opt-out option for parents, and thousands of parents in this school district have asked for that exemption. And I'll tell you, last night, many of the arguments against masks focused on parental choice, parents saying that schools shouldn't be making health decisions for children. But the school officials I was talking to told me that, look, schools have been making health decisions for kids for a very long time. That is part of their responsibility when students are on school property. I want you to hear what one school board member told me. Take a listen.
We certainly respect the opinions of our families. We have to make decisions based on what's best for all students, and we recognize that we're not all going to agree.
At the end of the day, Simone, they're just hoping that the focus can be on the kids instead of the politics. Simone.
Dasha, way to keep your cool in a very heated situation there. Thank you so much. Well, vital information on the number of COVID cases in some states seems to be disappearing, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, and public health experts are concerned for good reason. Andy Miller of Kaiser Health News joins me now on his reporting. Andy, explain this to us. What kind of data is missing and where?
Well, it depends on the state, but certainly some states like Florida are going to just 1 day a week in terms of reporting COVID cases and hospitalizations. And you have a state like Georgia that no longer gives information about COVID cases in prisons. And the information they give on long-term care facilities, cases and deaths there, has been removed. And the state is sending a reporter or the public to a federal site, which is a lot clunkier to kind of navigate. So there are public health people that the experts are saying, look, this surge that we're going through now may be worse than the other 3 in terms of cases and hospitalizations, because the Delta variant certainly is raging in the region where I live, which is in the South.
I want to talk about a comment from the director of the American Public Health Association, who said that the trend is, quote, not good for government and the public because it gives the appearance that governments are, quote, hiding stuff. And obviously, this is a time when we need to be restoring trust in institutions. So what are the reasons given for the data pullback?
Well, if you look at the Georgia Department of Corrections, they said a month ago that cases are down and vaccinations are up. So regular report. We know since over the last couple of months, really, that the infection rates are going up. And when I asked the state whether they were going to resume reporting on prison cases, they said, well, maybe we'll do it. We'll rethink it. We'll think about it eventually again. But when I asked, they said there were 308 cases in prisons now in the state. And we definitely have had a high COVID infection rate in our state prisons.
Andy, thank you so much for your reporting on this. We'll be right back.
Thanks for having me.
Another blow for the Biden administration, the Supreme Court blocking the CDC from enforcing the federal eviction moratorium on evicting renters, putting millions at risk of losing their homes. It's just the latest defeat at the high court for the Biden administration, which has been trying to keep this ban in place. I want to bring in NBC News justice correspondent Pete Williams. Pete, thanks so much for being here. Break down the Supreme Court's ruling for us. What does this decision mean for the roughly 3.5 million people here in the U.S. who said they faced eviction in the next 2 months?
Right. For many of them, it'll mean that the landlords can once again resume the process of trying to evict them. It won't happen immediately. In some states, the courts will have to allow them to do it. But the Supreme Court basically said the CDC does not have the authority to do this on its own, that only Congress can do something so sweeping and so nationwide. It's one thing, the court said, for the CDC to do what the law says about doing quarantines for localized outbreaks of disease to keep it from spreading. It's quite another here to take people who don't even have COVID and say that they have to be subject to this moratorium because if they move out, they might either spread the infection themselves or get infected from others. It's just too removed from what the law says the CDC has the authority to do, according to the majority of the Supreme Court.
So the current moratorium began earlier this month, and a prior pause on evictions was also challenged back in June, but the justices left that in despite signaling their concerns. So why do that, but then block this latest one?
Well, I think, yeah, that's a good question. I think people on the other side would say, why did the Biden administration try to get the CDC to do this again after the Supreme Court signaled so strongly in June that it didn't think this was permissible? But to answer your question, what happened here is the Supreme Court just said in June, look, this thing has only a little time to go, so why bother? We think the CDC doesn't have authority to do this, but it's about to expire anyway. Now, the new one was just put into a place and would go through the end of October, so the Supreme Court said, OK, now we really mean it.
And, Pete, is there anything else the Biden administration can do at this point?
Well, yes, it can encourage Congress to do this. But, of course, the reason we're in this pickle in the first place is that Congress didn't want to do it the last time around. So now it's trying to encourage states and localities to impose their own restrictions on evictions or come up with their own aid programs. Of course, in the meantime, the government is struggling to try to get the money that's in this congressional aid program to renters and landlords intended to try to aid financially this situation to keep it from happening.
A lot of people stand to be impacted by this. So, Pete, thanks so much.
You bet.
The Texas House passing a controversial voting bill, setting the stage for restrictive voting laws in the state. The vote went along party lines, backed by Republicans, with only one GOP member voting against it. NBCNews.com senior reporter Jane Tim joins us now. Jane, so they gave a final passage this afternoon. The legislation is slightly different than the one passed by the state Senate, but what are the key points here? What does that House version look like?
Yeah, Simone. So the bills are a little bit different. But broadly, we know it does a couple of things. It bans certain early voting options that were championed during the last election, like overnight voting, early voting, as well as drive-through early voting. It empowers partisan poll watchers, and it adds new requirements for voting by mail. And it changes some of the required early voting. But in some, it does tend to limit early voting for most of these large counties that utilize broad hours like those overnight hours. Now, the bills are a little bit different, but the lawmakers will work out the differences between the two versions next in something called a conference committee. So the fine print we still have yet to see, but these are the provisions you're likely to see in the final because they're in both bills. So we know lawmakers can agree on that.
So, Jane, what happens next? There's just a little over a week before the special session ends. How quickly is it expected to end up on Governor Abbott's desk?
Quite quickly. So they need to finish this all by about Labor Day and get the governor to sign it by Labor Day for them to, or at least to get it on his desk by Labor Day, for them to not have to start from the beginning. Democrats' delay tactics have made this very difficult and the timeline quite quick. So we know that after the conference committee, after they reconcile the two bills, it'll go back to the House and the Senate for one final up or down vote, no amendments, and then it goes to the governor's desk. That's going to happen in the next 8 days. Around that, and it's they're going to have to move quickly. And Democrats can delay it at all. They do risk having to start all the way from the beginning of the legislative process with the public hearings, all the votes, all the marathon sessions we've seen again and again with this fight.
So I want to dig into the debate a little bit because it got pretty heated at one point when the word racism came into play. Check this out.
Intentional discrimination against people of a certain race, is that racism?
That is. We can talk about racial impacts of this legislation without accusing members of this body of being racist.
So at one point, the Republican House Speaker actually asked members not to use the word racism. Why? On what grounds?
Repeatedly. I mean, he did this as an effort to say, let's keep things civil, let's keep tensions limited. But Democrats' counter-argument was essentially that they think these bills are racist. They want to talk about racism here. They want to use the word. I spoke with Rep. Gina Hinojosa right after she made those remarks, which were designed to push this. You could hear the shouting from her colleagues, probably the Republicans on the floor. And she said, I will not be censured on the floor of the House. You can't ban a word. So they definitely had these arguments. And the argument really did come down to this. Democrats believe these bills make it harder for Black and brown members of the Texas community to vote. And they want to talk about it. And they did.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like censorship, which is exactly what we've been hearing so many conservatives talk about lately. All right, Jane, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Taking on college life for the first time can be overwhelming, but this year, many incoming college students are also coming off virtual learning for more than a year. NBC News Now co-anchor Savannah Sellers talked to students about their feelings on returning to the classroom.
I've never been on campus to learn.
I don't remember what it's like to take a test without using my notes.
I am really not excited to go in person.
After more than a year of online learning, many students are returning to the physical classroom.
I can definitely say that the nerve of going back into a classroom is going to be there.
We spoke to Andrew Labite earlier this year. He told us he bent the rules to get by academically.
I know a lot of my friends personally. We're just looking to get the answer and just copy paste the answer to just get the points.
Which is the version that's cheating, right?
Technically, yeah.
I can definitely say that there are some assignments that I should not have gotten the grade that I got on because I had access to Google.
Now he's in his second year at Mizzou and worried about what he didn't learn last year.
I'm going to have my fingers crossed and hope that Calc 3 does not build too much on Calc 2. And if it does, it's going to be a lot of YouTubing and self-learning and reteaching on everything that I do need to know.
I mean, it sounds like a part-time job of your sophomore year to try to relearn your freshman year.
Pretty much, yeah.
For incoming freshmen, college is a big transition no matter what, let alone after a year plus of virtual learning. How do you feel?
I'm really nervous, but I'm also really excited because it gives me an opportunity to get back what I lost my senior year.
The last time Jessica Aloba sat in a physical classroom, she was a junior in high school back in early 2020.
So do you think you learned as much last year in an online format as you would have in a classroom?
I definitely don't. It definitely took away a lot of the advantages that in-person gives. I feel like I definitely learned a lot less than I would have in person.
Now, Jessica's starting her first semester of college at the University of Kansas.
Whenever I think about coming to class and being taken off guard by a question or a professor directly calling on me in order to answer, I definitely feel a lot of that anxiety.
Have you been practicing in your head?
Oh, definitely a lot, all the time.
To combat what some are calling a lost year, colleges are beefing up their tutoring services, identifying ways students can help each other. Sacramento State's using federal relief money to double the number of supplemental courses taught by upperclassmen. They're offered in subjects with high failure rates, like science and math. At UC Riverside, officials are expanding a text message-based peer mentoring program launched during the pandemic to help new students adjust.
Was there ever a time that you thought, maybe I'm just not going to go to college, or maybe not right now?
It was definitely up in the air.
Jessica credits the University of Kansas for stepping in with scholarships and resources to convince her to enroll. She participated in their Early Start program, which gave her more time to get used to campus life.
Is this culture shock to be on a college campus?
Definitely. Just immediately as I got out of the car and I was loading up my dorm, the amount of people that I saw just stepping off is more than I saw for the majority of my school year, senior year.